Alara Voss felt the eyes of 300 wolves on her back as she stepped onto the stone floor of the trial circle, and she knew, in that exact moment, that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life on purpose. The Blackthorn pack had gathered inside the Great Hall for 200 years to watch this same ritual unfold, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the king himself sat on the raised throne at the edge of the circle, his golden eyes tracking every candidate who dared to enter. Draven Ashborn had ruled for 340 years. He had buried 4 generations of his own council. He had watched empires of wolves rise and fall beneath his throne, and in all that time, his wolf had never once stirred for another living soul. Alara was not here to change that. She smoothed the front of her plain gray dress, the fabric rough against her palms, and forced her breathing to stay even. Around her, other candidates wore silks dyed the color of dawn, jewelry passed down through bloodlines older than the mountains surrounding Blackthorn territory. She wore nothing but her own skin, and a promise she had made to herself the night before. Fail early, fail quietly, and get out before anyone noticed her sister hiding 3 floors below in the servants' quarters. "Candidates," called Elder Renshaw, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade through silk. "Tonight begins the first of the Luna trials. Only one among you will stand beside King Ashborn when the moon reaches its peak on the 10th night. The rest of you will return to your packs, your names forgotten by history." Alara almost laughed. Forgotten by history was exactly what she wanted. She glanced sideways at the woman beside her, a broad-shouldered wolf named Priya Nandan, who radiated the kind of confidence that came from being born into a bloodline of champions. Priya's eyes were fixed forward, her jaw set, her whole body coiled like a spring ready to snap. This was a woman who had trained her entire life for this single night. Alara had trained for nothing except how to disappear. "First trial," Elder Renshaw announced. "Strength and dominance. Each candidate will face an opponent, chosen by lottery. Submission or unconsciousness ends the match. There is no shame in losing, only in refusing to try." Alara's stomach twisted. She had expected something like negotiation, or diplomacy, or even a hunting trial where she could hang back without drawing attention. Not this. Not something so physical that everyone in the hall would watch her fail up close. The lottery wheel spun, its wooden gears clicking against each other in a rhythm that seemed far too loud in the silent hall. When it stopped, Elder Renshaw read the names aloud, and Alara's stomach dropped when she heard her own, paired against a wolf named Dahlia Frost, a woman nearly a foot taller, with arms like carved stone. This would be easy, in the worst possible way. Alara stepped into the ring across from Dahlia, who cracked her knuckles and gave her a look that was somewhere between pity and boredom. The crowd's murmuring rose and fell like waves against a shore. Somewhere above them, on his throne, King Ashborn leaned forward slightly, his chin resting against his knuckles, watching with the detached patience of a man who had seen 10,000 fights and expected nothing new from this one. "Begin," Elder Renshaw called. Dahlia moved first, a controlled lunge meant to test Alara's footing rather than end things immediately. Alara sidestepped it easily. She was fast. She had always been fast. Faster than her sister. Faster than most of the wolves in her home pack. Speed had kept her alive more than once. But speed was not what she needed tonight. Dahlia struck again, harder this time, and Alara let the blow catch her shoulder, spinning her half a step off balance. It didn't hurt much. She had taken worse falls climbing trees as a child, but she staggered anyway, exaggerating the impact just enough to look convincing, without looking suspicious. The crowd made a small sound of disappointment, the kind reserved for candidates who were already being written off. Dahlia pressed her advantage, coming in with a sweeping strike aimed at Alara's legs. This was the moment. Alara could have ducked under it, could have used the opening to drive her elbow into Dahlia's ribs and end the match in 3 seconds. Instead, she let her knees buckle, let herself drop to the stone floor with a controlled fall that looked far more painful than it actually was. Dahlia stood over her, breathing hard, waiting for a sign of surrender. "I yield," Alara said, loud enough for the judges to hear, quiet enough that her voice cracked just slightly, as though shame had stolen half her breath. The hall fell into that particular silence that follows an anticlimax, a collective exhale of wolves who had expected more of a show. Elder Renshaw marked something on his scroll without looking up. Dahlia offered Elara a hand to help her up, an unexpected kindness that made Elara's chest tighten with something close to guilt. "You're better than that fall," Dahlia muttered, as she pulled Elara to her feet. "I saw your footwork. You could have taken me." "Guess I got nervous," Elara said, and looked away, before Dahlia could study her face too closely. She returned to the edge of the circle, keeping her eyes on the floor, letting her shoulders slump in a posture of quiet defeat. Around her, the other candidates barely spared her a glance. She was exactly what she wanted to be, forgettable. Except for one set of eyes that had not looked away from her since the moment she entered the ring. King Draven Ashborn had watched over 300 Luna trials across the centuries. He had watched wolves fight for his throne with a hunger that bordered on madness, each one convinced that becoming his mate would grant them a permanence no other title could offer. He had grown so accustomed to that hunger that he had stopped noticing individual faces long ago. Winners and losers blurred together into a long parade of ambition. But something about the woman in the gray dress had caught in his mind, like a splinter he could not shake loose. He had watched her footwork in the opening seconds of the match, the small shift of her weight before Dahlia's first strike, the perfect timing of her sidestep. That was not the movement of a novice. That was the movement of someone who had trained, who understood the mechanics of a fight on an instinctive level. And then, in the space of a single breath, she had thrown all of it away. Draven did not believe in accidents. Not in a fight, and not in a trial designed to determine the future of his pack. He watched her retreat to the shadows at the edge of the circle, watched the careful way she avoided eye contact with anyone, including him, and felt something stir low in his chest that he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. His wolf, silent for 340 years, pressed against the inside of his ribs like a question waiting to be answered. He ignored it. He had learned, over the centuries, that instinct without evidence was a luxury he could not afford as a king. The trials continued through the evening. Match after match unfolded in the circle, candidates proving their strength, their speed, their willingness to bleed for a crown they had not yet earned. Draven watched each one with the same careful attention, cataloging strengths and weaknesses the way a general studies a battlefield. But his eyes kept drifting back to the woman in gray, seated now at the far edge of the hall, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. When the trials ended for the night, Elder Renshaw called the remaining candidates forward to receive their scores. Elara stood near the back of the line, expecting to hear her name called last, expecting the dismissive tone reserved for the weakest competitors. Instead, Elder Renshaw simply noted her position and moved on, his attention already fixed on the stronger candidates who had impressed the crowd. She had done it. She had survived the first trial, without drawing suspicion, without revealing anything that might endanger her sister. Relief flooded through her chest, warm and immediate, and she allowed herself the smallest exhale as she turned to leave the hall. Elara Voss. The voice stopped her cold. It was not Elder Renshaw's voice. It was deeper, quieter, and carried an authority that made the air itself seem to still around her. She turned slowly, and found herself facing King Draven Ashborn, who had descended from his throne without her noticing, moving with the kind of silent grace that only came from centuries of practice. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, his presence filling the space around him, in a way that made the crowded hall feel suddenly empty, except for the two of them. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing her head, careful to keep her voice steady, despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "That was an interesting fall you took," he said, his golden eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Dahlia Frost is strong, but she is not that strong. I have watched enough fights to know the difference between losing and choosing to lose." Elara's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I was nervous, Your Majesty. This is my first trial. I am sure it showed." "Perhaps." Draven's gaze did not waver. "Or perhaps you have a reason for wanting to lose that has nothing to do with nerves." She met his eyes then, just for a moment, and something passed between them that she could not name, a current of recognition that made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I have no such reason, Your Majesty," she said, and forced herself to hold his gaze, despite every instinct urging her to look away. Draven studied her for a long moment, long enough that the silence between them became its own kind of conversation. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his throne, leaving Alara standing alone in the emptying hall, her heart pounding against her ribs like something trying to break free. She did not know it yet, but somewhere deep inside the king who had ruled for 340 years without a mate, something ancient and long dormant had just opened one eye. She made her way through the narrow servants' corridor beneath the great hall, the stone walls damp and cool against her fingertips, as she counted the doors from memory. Her sister, Nadia, was waiting behind the fourth door on the left, exactly where Alara had left her that morning, dressed in the plain uniform of a kitchen worker, with her dark hair pinned back beneath a servant's cap. "You're alive," Nadia said, the moment the door closed behind Alara, relief written across every line of her face. "I heard the trials started tonight. Did anyone recognize you?" "No one recognized me," Alara said, sinking onto the narrow cot against the wall, the adrenaline of the evening finally draining out of her limbs. "I lost my first match on purpose. No one even looked at me twice after that." Nadia's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the worry in her eyes did not fully disappear. "And the king? Did he look at you?" Alara hesitated, thinking of those golden eyes studying her with an intensity that had felt like being seen for the first time in her life. "He asked me a question," she admitted. "About the fall. He said it looked deliberate." "Alara." Nadia's voice sharpened with alarm. "If he suspects you're hiding something, he could investigate. He could find out about the debt, about why we're really here." "He doesn't know anything," Alara said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them. "I denied it. He let it go. But he hadn't let it go, not entirely, and some small part of Alara had felt it in the weight of his gaze as he walked away. She pushed the thought aside and reached for her sister's hand instead, holding it tightly as she had done every night since their mother's death, when the debt to the pack elders had fallen onto shoulders far too young to carry it. "9 more trials," Alara said quietly. "I only need to fail 9 more times, and then this will all be over. We'll pay off what we owe, and we'll leave this place and never look back." Nadia nodded, though the fear in her eyes did not fully fade. Outside the small servants' quarters, the great hall of Blackthorn Pack settled into silence, its stone walls holding centuries of secrets within them. Somewhere above, in a chamber lit by a single burning fire, King Draven Ashborn sat awake long past midnight, staring into the flames, and wondering why a woman in a gray dress had managed to unsettle something inside him that 340 years of solitude had never touched. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, a sensation he had almost forgotten how to recognize. It was not desire, not exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the feeling of finding a familiar landmark in unfamiliar territory. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself that curiosity was not the same as fate, and that a woman who lied to his face about something as simple as a fall was hardly a candidate worth his attention. But as the fire burned low and the night stretched on, he found himself thinking of golden lamplight catching against dark hair, of a voice that trembled just enough to sound convincing, and not enough to sound true, and of eyes that had held his, without flinching, even as fear lived clearly behind them. 9 trials remained. Draven did not yet know what he was looking for in the woman called Alara Voss, but for the first time in over 3 centuries, he found himself genuinely curious to find out. The second trial began 3 days later, and this time Alara knew exactly what kind of failure she needed to perform. Word had spread quickly through the servants' quarters about the nature of the next test. Loyalty, they said. A trial designed to measure how far each candidate would go to protect the pack, and more importantly, how far they would go to protect themselves. Alara had spent the 3 days between trials memorizing every detail she could gather, preparing herself the way a soldier prepares for a battle she intends to lose on purpose. She found Nadia in the kitchen storeroom before dawn, sorting through crates of root vegetables with the kind of quiet efficiency that had kept her invisible among the other servants for weeks. Nadia looked up when Alara entered, her face tightening with the same worry that had lived there since the first trial. "They're saying this one is dangerous," Nadia whispered, glancing toward the door to make sure no one else could hear. Some of the older servants remember the last loyalty trial. A candidate was forced to choose between exposing a friend's secret or losing her place entirely. "I know," Alara said, setting down the basket of bread she had carried in, as an excuse to visit. "I need you to tell me everything you've heard. Every rumor, every detail. If I know what's coming, I can plan my failure carefully, instead of stumbling into it." Nadia's hands stilled over the vegetables. "You make it sound so simple, like failing is a skill you can practice." "It is a skill," Alara said, managing a small, tired smile. "I've had 3 days to practice looking weak in front of people who expect me to be strong. Trust me, it takes more effort than winning ever would." The trial began at midday, held not in the Great Hall this time, but in the Pack's private council chamber, a smaller room, lined with portraits of Ashbourne ancestors stretching back centuries. Only a dozen candidates remained after the first round of eliminations, and Alara noted with some relief that she was among the weaker half, a position that suited her purposes perfectly. Elder Renshaw explained the trial structure in a voice that carried the weight of tradition. Each candidate would be presented with a scenario involving a fellow competitor's secret, something private, and potentially damaging if revealed. The candidate would then be given a choice: expose the secret to gain favor with the judges, or protect it and accept a lower score. "Loyalty is not measured by silence alone," Elder Renshaw said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled candidates. "It is measured by the strength to protect what matters, even when doing so costs you something." Alara's mind raced. If loyalty was rewarded, then true failure meant choosing exposure over protection, a betrayal that would look calculated and cold in front of the judges. But something in her recoiled from the idea of hurting another candidate, simply to secure her own dismissal from the trials. She had come here to disappear, not to become someone she could not respect in the mirror. When her turn came, she was led to a small alcove where Elder Renshaw presented her with a folded piece of parchment. Inside was written a single sentence: "Priya Nandan's younger brother was born outside the Pack's approved bloodline, a fact that, if revealed, could see the entire Nandan family stripped of their standing within Blackthorn territory." Alara stared at the words for a long moment, her stomach twisting with the weight of what she now knew. Priya, the confident wolf who had shown Alara nothing but quiet respect during the first trial, stood across the chamber, unaware that her family's deepest secret now rested in Alara's hands. "You may reveal this information to the judges for additional favor," Elder Renshaw said, "or you may choose to remain silent and accept the consequences of your discretion." Every instinct in Alara's body told her to protect Priya's secret. It was the only decent thing to do, the only choice that would let her sleep at night. But protecting the secret would earn her favor in the judge's eyes for demonstrating loyalty, the exact opposite of what she needed. She had walked into this trial expecting to fail through betrayal, and instead found herself trapped by her own conscience. She thought quickly, searching for a third path that neither of the presented options accounted for. "I won't reveal what I've been told," Alara said finally, loud enough for the nearby judges to hear. "But I also won't participate in a trial that asks me to weigh another person's family against my own advancement. I withdraw from this portion of the evaluation." A murmur rippled through the gathered judges. Elder Renshaw's expression flickered with something between surprise and irritation, clearly unprepared for a response that fit neither category of his carefully constructed test. "Withdrawal carries the same penalty as failure," he said after a moment, recovering his composure. "Your score for this trial will be recorded at the lowest possible mark." "I understand," Alara said, and meant it. This was exactly the outcome she had wanted, achieved in a way that let her walk away without betraying someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. She returned to her seat at the edge of the chamber, aware of the weight of gazes following her, some curious, some dismissive. She did not look toward the raised platform where King Ashbourne observed the proceedings, though she could feel his attention on her like a physical touch against her skin. Draven had watched the entire exchange unfold with growing fascination. He had presided over dozens of loyalty trials throughout his reign, and he had seen candidates lie, betray, and manipulate their way through this exact test more times than he cared to count. He had never once seen a candidate refuse to play the game entirely, choosing instead to sacrifice her own standing rather than harm someone else. It should not have surprised him after what he had witnessed during the first trial, and yet it did, in a way that unsettled the careful detachment he had cultivated over 3 centuries of ruling. Most candidates who entered these trials cared about one thing: the crown, the power, the permanence of standing beside a king who would outlive them all. Elara Voss seemed to care about none of it. He watched her walk back to her seat, her spine straight, despite the low score she had just accepted, her expression carefully composed, even though he could see the tension still lingering in her shoulders. His wolf pressed harder against the inside of his chest, an insistence he had not felt in longer than he could remember, and for the first time in 340 years, Draven found himself questioning whether the crown itself was the wrong prize to be measuring his candidates by. After the trial concluded, Draven summoned Elder Renshaw to his private study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books collected across centuries of his reign. The old wolf entered with the careful deference that came from decades of service, though his eyes carried a question he had not yet voiced. "Tell me about the candidate Elara Voss," Draven said, not bothering with preamble. "What do you know of her background, her pack of origin, her family?" Elder Renshaw hesitated, clearly surprised by the direct interest. "Very little, Your Majesty. She arrived from a smaller pack to the north, submitted her application through the standard channels. Her records indicate no notable achievements, no distinguished bloodline. Frankly, I was surprised the council approved her candidacy at all. And yet she has failed 2 trials, in ways that suggest deliberate choice, rather than genuine inadequacy," Draven said, watching the old wolf's face carefully, for any flicker of recognition. "Does that not strike you as unusual?" "Candidates fail for many reasons, Your Majesty. Nerves, unfamiliarity with our customs, simple lack of skill. I would not read too deeply into the behavior of a single competitor who is unlikely to advance much further regardless." Draven said nothing for a long moment, turning the old wolf's words over in his mind. It was possible Elder Renshaw was right, that he was reading intention into what amounted to nothing more than an unremarkable candidate's unremarkable performance. But 340 years of instinct told him otherwise, and his wolf, silent for so long that Draven had nearly forgotten what its voice sounded like, was telling him something entirely different. "Have someone look into her origins more closely," Draven said finally, quietly. "I want to know everything about the pack she came from, and I want to know if there is any reason a candidate might choose to fail these trials, rather than simply withdraw entirely." Elder Renshaw's eyebrows rose slightly, but he bowed his head in acknowledgement. "As you wish, Your Majesty." After the old wolf departed, Draven remained alone in his study long into the evening, the fire crackling softly in the hearth as shadows lengthened across the rows of ancient books. He thought of Elara's face, in the moment she had refused to expose Priya's secret, the quiet conviction in her voice, as she accepted the lowest possible score, rather than compromise something she clearly believed mattered more than the crown. He had ruled Blackthorn Pack for 3 centuries, believing that strength and ambition were the only qualities worth measuring in a potential mate, the only qualities that could match the weight of eternity he carried on his shoulders. But watching Elara Voss choose integrity over advancement, not once but twice now, made him wonder if he had been measuring the wrong things entirely. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters below the great hall, Elara sat beside her sister's cot, recounting the day's events, in a whisper meant to stay contained within the small room's stone walls. "You refused to betray her," Nadia said, wonder coloring her voice. "Even though it would have made your failure look more convincing." "I couldn't do it," Elara admitted. "Priya has been nothing but kind to me since the first trial. I couldn't hand over her family's secret just to secure my own dismissal from this place. What if the king suspects something now? What if your refusal drew more attention than a simple loss would have?" Elara thought of the weight of Draven's gaze following her across the council chamber, the way his golden eyes seemed to see past every careful mask she had constructed since arriving at Blackthorn. A chill settled into her chest, not entirely unpleasant, though she could not name the feeling that accompanied it. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, "but I know I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd chosen the other option. Some things matter more than staying hidden, Nadia. Even here." Her sister studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Just be careful," she said finally. "We came here for one reason. Don't let anything, or anyone, make you forget that." Elara nodded, though even as she agreed, some small and stubborn part of her mind kept returning to golden eyes that had watched her with an intensity she could not fully explain away as simple royal curiosity. 8 trials remained. She told herself she only needed to survive them, to fail them quietly and completely, and then this strange chapter of her life would end, and she could return to the obscurity she had always preferred. She did not yet understand that some things, once set into motion, could not be stopped simply by wishing them away. News of Alara's withdrawal from the loyalty trial spread through Blackthorn territory faster than she had anticipated, and not in the way she had hoped. She had expected the story to die quietly, another forgettable footnote among dozens of candidates who failed to impress the judges. Instead, whispers followed her through the corridors over the following days, servants and pack members alike murmuring about the quiet woman who had chosen to protect a stranger's secret rather than advance her own standing. Some called it foolish, others called it noble. No one seemed to know quite what to make of her, and that uncertainty made Alara more visible than she had ever wanted to be. Priya Nandan found her 3 mornings later in the training yard, behind the servants' quarters, where Alara had gone to practice basic forms alone, away from prying eyes. Priya's expression carried none of the wariness Alara had braced herself for. Instead, there was something closer to gratitude, mixed with confusion, that seemed to deepen the longer she studied Alara's face. "You knew," Priya said without preamble, crossing the training yard with quick, purposeful steps. "About my brother. You knew, and you chose to lose rather than tell them." Alara's hands stilled at her sides. There was no point denying it now. "I did." "Why?" Priya's voice carried genuine bewilderment. "We barely know each other. You could have secured a better position for yourself. Instead, you threw away your own standing to protect someone you'd spoken to maybe twice." Alara considered the question carefully, choosing her words with the same care she had used to construct every lie she had told since arriving at Blackthorn. "Because your brother's existence isn't a weapon for me to use," she said finally. "Whatever the council thinks about bloodlines, that's not my judgment to make, and it's certainly not my secret to sell." Priya studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "Most candidates here would have sold their own mother for a better score," she said. "You're either the most foolish woman I've ever met, or the only honest one in this entire competition." "Maybe both," Alara said, allowing herself a small, tired smile. Priya laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even herself. "Whatever your reasons, I owe you a debt now. If there's ever anything I can do, you have my word I'll do it." Alara thanked her, though the words felt strange in her mouth. She had come to Blackthorn, expecting isolation, expecting to move through the trials as a ghost, unnoticed and unremarked upon, until she could quietly withdraw and disappear. Instead, she was accumulating allies she had never intended to make, drawing attention she had never wanted, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a persistent worry gnawed at the edges of her careful plan. The 3rd trial arrived a week later, and this time the format shifted entirely. Rather than testing individual candidates against one another, the council announced a collective trial. All remaining competitors would be sent into the forest surrounding Blackthorn territory for 3 days, tasked with surviving on their own resourcefulness while demonstrating leadership, resilience, and the instincts that defined a true wolf. Alara understood immediately that this trial would be harder to fail convincingly than the previous 2. Physical combat and moral dilemmas offered clear, controllable moments where she could choose to falter. Survival in the wilderness offered no such clean opportunities. She would need to make herself appear inadequate over the course of 3 full days, without endangering herself in the process, a balancing act far more delicate than anything she had attempted so far. The candidates were dropped at separate points along the forest's edge at dawn, each given nothing but a hunting knife and a water skin, expected to find their own way back to Blackthorn's gates by the 3rd sunset. Alara watched the other competitors disappear into the tree line with the confident strides of wolves who had trained for exactly this kind of challenge their entire lives, and felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She had grown up in the northern hills, in a small pack that valued survival skills as a matter of daily necessity, rather than aristocratic tradition. She could track, hunt, and navigate by the stars better than most of the candidates competing beside her. That skill, so carefully honed throughout her childhood, would now need to remain hidden. She wandered into the forest with deliberately clumsy steps, snapping twigs beneath her feet that a more careful wolf would have avoided, letting her pace grow erratic and uncertain. By midday, she had made camp in a shallow depression near a stream, close enough to water that she would not risk genuine danger, far enough from the more obvious trails that she was unlikely to encounter other candidates who might notice her carefully performed incompetence. The first night passed uneventfully, the forest settling into the quiet rhythms of nocturnal life around her small camp. Alara slept lightly, a habit ingrained from years of watching over her sister, and woke before dawn to the sound of something moving through the underbrush nearby. She sat up slowly, senses sharpening despite her careful cultivation of a helpless persona over the past day. The sound came again, closer this time, and Alara's hand moved instinctively toward the hunting knife at her belt, before she forced herself to still. A figure emerged from the shadows between the trees, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of silent grace that Alara had come to recognize instantly. "Your Majesty," she said, scrambling to her feet, heart hammering against her ribs. "I didn't expect. I often walk the trial grounds during these tests," Draven said, his golden eyes catching the pale light of the coming dawn. "It allows me to observe candidates in circumstances they cannot stage for an audience." Alara's blood ran cold. If he had been watching, if he had seen through her carefully clumsy footsteps and her deliberately poor camp placement, then everything she had worked to hide could unravel in this single moment. "I've been managing," she said carefully. "The forest isn't as difficult as some of the other candidates might find it." "No," Draven agreed, stepping closer, his gaze sweeping across her small camp with an assessing look that made her skin prickle. "I don't imagine it is difficult for you at all." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Alara held his gaze, refusing to look away, despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly, as though her defiance amused him more than it concerned him. "You chose your camp well," he continued, gesturing toward the stream nearby. "Close enough to fresh water, far enough from the main trails to avoid unwanted company, positioned so the rock formation behind you would break the wind overnight. That is not the choice of someone who is struggling to survive out here." "Perhaps I got lucky," Alara said, though the words sounded weak even to her own ears. Draven's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile, an expression that transformed his face in a way that made Alara's breath catch unexpectedly. "You have gotten lucky twice now, in ways that consistently work against your own advancement. I am beginning to think luck has very little to do with it." Alara said nothing, unable to find a response that would satisfy his obvious suspicion without confirming it outright. The silence stretched between them, filled with something neither of them seemed willing to name. "I am not here to expose you," Draven said finally, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "Whatever reason brings you to these trials with such reluctance, I find myself curious rather than concerned. That is a rare feeling for me, after 3 centuries of watching ambition wear the same predictable face over and over again." "Curiosity can be dangerous, Your Majesty," Alara said quietly, thinking of her sister waiting 3 days' journey behind them, thinking of the debt that had brought them both to this dangerous place. "So can suppression," Draven replied. "I have suppressed my own instincts for longer than you have been alive, Alara Voss. I find I am growing tired of it." The words settled over her like something heavier than they should have been, and for a moment, standing in the pale gray light of dawn with the King of Blackthorn Pack studying her, as though she were the only interesting thing in 300 years of his existence, Alara forgot entirely about the careful performance she had constructed to survive these trials. "I should continue on," she said finally, breaking the silence before it could grow into something she was not prepared to understand. "The trial requires that I reach the gates by the 3rd sunset." "Of course," Draven said, stepping back to let her pass, though his eyes did not leave her face until she had disappeared into the trees ahead. "I look forward to seeing how you choose to fail this trial as well, Alara Voss. I suspect it will be just as interesting as the last 2. She walked for nearly an hour after leaving him behind, before her heartbeat finally returned to something resembling normal, her mind racing through every word of their exchange, searching for some clue about how much he truly suspected, and how much longer she could maintain the careful fiction she had built. By the 3rd sunset, Alara arrived at Blackthorn's gates deliberately last among the surviving candidates, her clothes torn just enough to suggest hardship, her expression carefully exhausted despite the fact that 3 days in the forest had felt almost restful compared to the constant tension of the trials themselves. Elder Renshaw noted her arrival with visible disappointment, marking her performance as merely adequate rather than impressive. But as she passed through the gates and into the torchlit courtyard beyond, she caught sight of King Ashbourne watching from the upper balcony, his expression unreadable in the flickering light, and understood with sudden clarity that adequate performances would no longer be enough to satisfy the growing curiosity she had somehow, against every careful plan she had made, managed to awaken in him. 7 trials remained, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, Elara found herself uncertain whether she was still running toward escape, or slowly, unknowingly, running toward something else entirely. The days following the forest trial settled into an uneasy rhythm that Elara found harder to manage with each passing morning. She had grown accustomed to moving through Blackthorn territory unnoticed, a skill she had practiced since childhood, but the king's attention had changed something fundamental in how the pack now perceived her. Servants who had never spared her a second glance now watched her with open curiosity as she crossed the courtyard. Other candidates, who had dismissed her as unremarkable competition after her first 2 failures, now eyed her with a wariness that suggested they too had noticed the shift in how the king regarded her. Elara found Nadia in the laundry quarters, arms deep in a basin of soapy water, her shoulders tense in a way that told Elara something had happened before she even spoke. "People are talking," Nadia said quietly, not looking up from her work. "About you and the king, about how he sought you out during the forest trial. One of the older servants mentioned it to me directly, though she doesn't know we're sisters." Elara's stomach tightened. What exactly did she say? That the king has never once broken from his usual routine to check on a candidate personally during a trial. Not in 300 years. She said it like it meant something, like everyone already suspects he's chosen someone before the trials have even finished. Elara sat down heavily on an overturned crate near the washing basins, exhaustion settling over her in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. "It doesn't mean anything," she said, though even as she spoke, she could not quite convince herself the words were true. "He's suspicious of me, that's all it is. He thinks I'm hiding something, and he's right, so he's watching me more closely than the others." "Or," Nadia said carefully, finally meeting her sister's eyes, "he's interested in you for reasons that have nothing to do with suspicion." "Don't," Elara said, sharper than she intended. "Don't say things like that. We came here for one purpose, Nadia. To protect you, to work off the debt, and to leave before anyone realizes who we really are, or why we're really here. I can't afford to think about anything else." Nadia said nothing for a long moment, returning her attention to the laundry in her hands, though the tension in her shoulders had not eased. "I'm not saying you should think about anything else," she said finally, quieter now. "I'm just saying that pretending you feel nothing might become harder than pretending to fail these trials." Elara did not have an answer for that, because some stubborn and unwelcome part of her mind knew her sister was right, even if she refused to admit it aloud. The 4th trial was announced 3 days later, and word spread through the servants' quarters long before the official proclamation reached the candidates themselves. This trial, unlike the previous 3, would take place not within the confines of Blackthorn territory, but at the border, shared with the neighboring Ashgrove pack, a rival territory whose relationship with Blackthorn had remained tense for generations. Elder Renshaw explained the trial's purpose to the assembled candidates in the Great Hall, his voice carrying the weight of old grievances that predated any of them. "Diplomacy," he announced, "is as vital to Aluna's role as strength or loyalty. Each candidate will be sent to negotiate a minor territorial dispute with representatives from Ashgrove pack. Your ability to resolve conflict without bloodshed will determine your standing in this trial." Elara listened carefully, already turning the trial structure over in her mind, searching for the angle that would allow her to fail convincingly, without endangering herself, or, more importantly, without endangering the fragile peace between the 2 packs. A diplomatic disaster caused by her own hand could have consequences far beyond her personal standing in the competition, consequences that might ripple outward and affect innocent people who had nothing to do with her carefully constructed lies. She spent the following 2 days preparing not for success, as the other candidates surely were, but for a very specific and controlled kind of failure. She studied what she could learn about the territorial dispute itself, a disagreement over hunting rights along a shared river border that had simmered unresolved for nearly a decade. She needed to understand the situation well enough to navigate it safely, even as she planned to bungle her own negotiation in a way that would look convincingly amateurish rather than deliberately careless. On the morning of the trial, the candidates traveled together to the border under the watchful escort of Blackthorn guards, the journey passing in a tense silence broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves against packed earth. Alara rode near the back of the group, her mind still turning over the delicate balance she needed to strike, when Priya Nandan guided her horse alongside hers. "You look like someone preparing for a funeral," Priya observed, studying Alara's tight expression with open curiosity. "This is just a negotiation, not a battle." "Negotiations can go wrong just as easily as battles," Alara replied, forcing a small smile despite the tension coiled in her chest. "I'd rather be overly prepared than caught off guard." "Fair enough," Priya said, though her eyes lingered on Alara's face a moment longer than necessary, as though she sensed there was more beneath the surface than Alara was willing to share. "For what it's worth, I hope you do well today. Whatever your reasons for holding back in the earlier trials, I think you're smarter than most of the wolves competing here. That should count for something in a trial built entirely around using your head." Alara thanked her, though the compliment settled uneasily in her chest, another reminder of how much harder it had become to remain invisible among people who had begun, against every careful plan she had made, to genuinely respect her. The border meeting took place in a neutral clearing, marked by ancient stone markers that had divided the two territories for centuries. Representatives from Ashgrove Pack waited on the far side, led by a stern-faced woman named Corvina Ash, whose reputation for shrewd negotiation had apparently preceded her among the Blackthorn candidates. Alara was called forward third in the rotation, following two candidates whose negotiations had gone reasonably well, securing minor concessions from the Ashgrove representatives through careful, measured diplomacy. She approached the clearing where Corvina waited, aware of King Ashbourne's presence at the edge of the gathering, his golden eyes tracking her movement with the same intensity she had grown uncomfortably accustomed to over the past weeks. "State your proposal regarding the river hunting rights," Corvina said without preamble, her sharp eyes assessing Alara with the practiced efficiency of someone who had negotiated 100 such disputes before. Alara had prepared her failure carefully, intending to offer terms so heavily weighted in Ashgrove's favor that Blackthorn's own counsel would view her negotiation as a diplomatic embarrassment. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she found herself hesitating, thinking of the actual families on both sides of the border who depended on that river for their survival, families who had nothing to do with the political games being played out in this trial. "I propose an equal rotation," Alara said finally, the words coming out before she had fully decided to say them. 3 days of hunting rights for Blackthorn families, followed by 3 days for Ashgrove families, repeating throughout each month. Neither pack loses access to the river, and the arrangement removes the ambiguity that has caused tension for the past decade. Corvina's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting such a straightforward and fair proposal from a candidate she had assumed would either capitulate entirely or push for unreasonable advantage. "That is remarkably balanced," she said slowly. "Most Blackthorn negotiators arrive determined to claim the larger share for their own pack." "I'm not interested in claiming anything that isn't fair," Alara said, and meant it, even as some distant part of her mind recognized that she had just failed spectacularly at failing, offering a solution so reasonable that it would likely be viewed as a success, rather than the diplomatic embarrassment she had intended. The negotiation concluded quickly after that, Corvina accepting the proposed terms with visible relief, clearly grateful for a resolution that did not require additional rounds of tense back and forth. As Alara turned to walk back toward the Blackthorn delegation, she caught sight of Draven watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between admiration and quiet amusement. "That was not a failure," he said quietly, falling into step beside her as the candidates regrouped for the journey home. "That was, by every measure this trial intended to test, a genuine success." "I got carried away," Alara admitted, unable to fully explain the strange impulse that had overtaken her in the clearing. "I was thinking about the families who actually depend on that river, and I couldn't bring myself to propose something unfair just to make myself look worse." Draven studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth she had not heard from him before. "You continue to surprise me, Alara Voss. Every time I believe I understand your intentions, you reveal another layer that contradicts everything I thought I knew." "Perhaps I don't fully understand my own intentions either," Alara admitted, the honesty slipping out before she could stop it. Perhaps not, Draven agreed, and for a moment, walking together through the quiet border clearing, with the setting sun casting long shadows across the ancient stone markers, Ilara allowed herself to forget, just briefly, about debts and disguises, and the careful failures she had planned so meticulously. It was only later that night, lying awake in the servants' quarters beside her sleeping sister, that Ilara realized with a sinking feeling in her chest exactly how much more difficult these trials had become. She had come to Blackthorn intending to fail quietly and disappear. Instead, with each passing trial, she found herself revealing more of who she truly was. And worse, she found herself no longer entirely certain that she wanted to hide it. 6 trials remained, and Ilara feared, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, that her carefully constructed plan was beginning to slip entirely beyond her control. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a silent guard who offered no explanation beyond the king's request for her immediate presence in his private study. Ilara's hands trembled as she dressed, her mind racing through every possible reason Draven might want to see her alone, away from the eyes of the other candidates, and the formal structure of the trials themselves. She thought of the successful negotiation at the border, of the way his gaze had lingered on her afterward, and wondered if this summons carried the same complicated warmth that had colored their last conversation. But some deeper instinct, honed by years of watching for danger, told her this meeting would be different. She was right. Draven's study occupied the highest tower of the Blackthorn Keep, its walls lined with books collected across 3 centuries of his reign, the morning light filtering through tall windows to illuminate dust motes drifting lazily through the air. He stood near the window when she entered, his back to her, his broad shoulders tense in a way that immediately confirmed her worst fears. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing her head, though her voice carried none of the confidence she tried to project. "Sit," Draven said, not turning to face her. His voice carried none of the warmth from their last conversation, replaced instead by something cold and measured that made her stomach twist with dread. Ilara sat carefully in the chair he indicated, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until Draven finally turned to face her, his golden eyes carrying an intensity that felt entirely different from the curiosity she had grown accustomed to. "I asked my counsel to investigate your background after the second trial," he said without preamble. "I told myself it was simple diligence, the kind of care I extend to any candidate who behaves unusually within these trials. But if I am honest, Ilara Voss, my curiosity about you had already become something more personal than official duty." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What did they find?" "Everything," Draven said, and the single word carried the weight of a verdict already decided. "I know your family's pack fell into significant debt to Blackthorn's council 3 years ago, after your mother's death left obligations unpaid. I know that debt was inherited by you and your younger sister, and I know that you did not come here seeking to become Luna at all. You came here because a clause buried within your family's debt agreement grants forgiveness to any relative who successfully completes service within Blackthorn territory, whether through the trials or through indentured labor." The room seemed to tilt around her. Every carefully constructed lie, every performance she had staged across 4 trials, dissolved in an instant beneath the weight of his knowledge. "How long have you known?" she managed finally. 3 days, Draven said. "Long enough to also discover that your sister, Nadia, has been working in my kitchens under a false name for the past 6 weeks, hidden away while you competed in trials meant to determine my mate." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. If he knew about Nadia, if he had connected every piece of their careful deception, then everything she had worked to protect since arriving at Blackthorn now hung in the balance of whatever judgment he was about to deliver. "Please," she said, all pretense abandoned now, desperation bleeding into her voice. "My sister has done nothing wrong. She's only here because I couldn't leave her behind. Couldn't risk the council finding some other way to collect on a debt that was never truly hers to owe. If you must punish someone, punish me. Let her go. Let her leave Blackthorn territory and never look back." Draven studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, the coldness receding just slightly, to reveal something closer to the intensity she had come to recognize from their earlier encounters. "You would sacrifice yourself entirely for her protection," he said quietly. without hesitation, without negotiation. "She's my sister," Elara said simply, as though that single fact explained everything that needed explaining. "I would do anything to keep her safe." "I am not interested in punishing either of you," Draven said, and the relief that flooded through Elara's chest was so sudden and overwhelming that she nearly wept. "I called you here because I wanted to hear the truth from you directly, rather than relying entirely on the reports my council compiled. I find I trust very little that comes to me secondhand these days." "Then you're not angry?" Elara asked, still uncertain, still bracing for some hidden consequence she had not yet anticipated. "I am many things," Draven said, moving closer, his golden eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Angry is not among them. Disappointed, perhaps, that you felt you could not simply tell me the truth from the beginning. But not angry. Would you have believed me?" Elara asked, the question sharper than she intended, years of careful self-protection bleeding into her voice. "If I had walked into these trials and told you honestly that I had no interest in becoming your Luna, that I was only here to settle a debt and protect my sister, would you have simply let me go, or would you have found some other way to extract what was owed?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an honesty that surprised her. "I do not know," he admitted. 340 years of ruling has taught me to be suspicious of every claim, every request, every act of apparent selflessness. I have been deceived more times than I care to remember by people who wanted something from my crown. I cannot say with certainty that I would have believed you, had you told me the truth from the start." The admission settled something uneasy in Elara's chest, a strange kind of validation for the lies she had told out of necessity rather than malice. "Then perhaps I was right not to trust you with it," she said, though the words carried less conviction than she intended. "Perhaps," Draven agreed, surprising her with his willingness to concede the point. "But I am telling you now, Elara Voss, that your family's debt is forgiven, effective immediately. Not through the completion of these trials, and not through any arrangement your family originally agreed to. It is forgiven, because I have decided it should be, and because no clause in any agreement should require a woman to disguise herself and compete for a crown she never wanted, simply to protect someone she loves." Elara stared at him, stunned into silence by the magnitude of what he had just offered. "Why would you do that?" Draven's expression softened, something vulnerable flickering behind his golden eyes that she had never seen from him before. "Because for the first time in 3 centuries, I find myself more interested in understanding a person than in evaluating a candidate," he said quietly. "And I cannot do that honestly, while you remain trapped by fear and obligation." "What happens now?" Elara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertainty, and something warmer and more dangerous tangling together in her chest. "That depends entirely on you," Draven said. "The debt is forgiven, regardless of your choice. Your sister is free to leave Blackthorn territory whenever she wishes, with safe passage, guaranteed, under my protection. You are free to withdraw from the remaining trials entirely, to walk away from this competition and this place without consequence, if that is what you truly want." Elara's mind raced through the possibilities, through months of careful planning suddenly rendered unnecessary by his unexpected generosity. She could leave. She could take Nadia and return to whatever life remained for them beyond Blackthorn's borders, free from debt, free from the danger of discovery, free from the strange and complicated feelings that had grown between her and the king, despite every effort to keep him at a careful distance. "And if I choose to stay?" she heard herself ask, the question surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Something shifted in Draven's expression, a cautious hope he seemed to be trying to suppress. "If you choose to stay," he said carefully, "then I would ask that you compete in the remaining trials honestly, without the careful failures you have staged throughout the previous 4. Not because I require you to win, but because I would like the chance to know the true measure of who you are, unclouded by fear or obligation, or the desperate need to disappear." Elara sat with the weight of his words for a long moment, considering everything that had brought her to this study, this conversation, this impossible choice now laid bare before her. She thought of her sister, finally free from the danger that had shadowed them both for years. She thought of the strange warmth that had grown in her chest every time Draven's golden eyes found hers across a crowded hall. She thought of the careful, controlled life she had built around hiding, and wondered, for the first time in longer than she could remember, what it might feel like to stop hiding entirely. "I need to speak with my sister," she said finally. "Before I decide anything, I need to make sure she is truly safe, truly free to choose her own path forward." "Of course," Draven said, something like relief passing across his features, as though he had expected a flat refusal, and found himself grateful for even this measured, uncertain response. "Take whatever time you need, Alara Voss. I have waited 340 years. I can wait a little longer for an answer." She left his study, with her mind spinning, the weight of everything that had just transpired settling slowly over her, as she made her way through the winding corridors of Blackthorn Keep, toward the kitchens where her sister waited, unaware that the careful world they had built together over the past 6 weeks had just been completely, irrevocably transformed. 5 trials remained on the official schedule, though Alara now understood that the true trial ahead of her had nothing to do with strength, loyalty, survival, or diplomacy. The true trial was deciding, honestly and without the protective armor of careful deception, whether she wanted to stay in a place that had somehow, despite every precaution she had taken, begun to feel less like a danger to escape, and more like a possibility she was not yet ready to walk away from. Nadia listened to the entire story in silence, her hands stilled over the bread dough she had been kneading when Alara found her in the kitchen's quiet corner, away from the bustle of the midday meal preparations. "He knows everything," Nadia repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. "About the debt, about me, about why we really came here." "Everything," Alara confirmed, sinking onto a stool beside the worn wooden table. "And he's forgiven the debt entirely, regardless of what I decide about the remaining trials. You're free, Nadia. We're both free. We could leave tomorrow if that's what you want." Nadia wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and something else Alara couldn't quite name. "Is that what you want?" she asked finally. "To leave?" Alara opened her mouth to answer immediately, the way she would have answered without hesitation just weeks ago, but the words caught in her throat. She thought of golden eyes that had watched her with growing warmth across 5 trials, of a king who had offered her freedom without demanding anything in return, of the strange, dangerous feeling that had settled into her chest despite every effort to keep it contained. "I don't know anymore," she admitted quietly. "I came here with one purpose, and that purpose has been resolved in a way I never expected. I don't know what I want beyond that." Nadia studied her sister's face for a long moment, a small, knowing smile beginning to form at the corners of her mouth. "You care about him," she said, not a question, but a simple statement of fact. "Somewhere between all those trials, you were trying so hard to fail, you started caring about the king." Alara didn't deny it, because denial felt suddenly pointless, in the face of her sister's certainty. "It doesn't matter how I feel," she said instead. "He's a king, who has ruled for 340 years. I'm nobody, Nadia. A woman from a small pack in the north, with nothing to offer beyond the debt he's already forgiven, out of what was probably simple kindness." "You're not nobody," Nadia said firmly, reaching across the table to take her sister's hand. "You're the woman who refused to betray a stranger's secret, even when it cost you everything. You're the woman who negotiated a fair peace at the border, instead of taking the easy path toward failure. If he spent 5 trials watching you do those things and still wants to know you better, I don't think it has anything to do with kindness alone." Alara said nothing, though her sister's words settled into the uncertain space in her chest, where fear and hope had begun to tangle together in equal measure. "What will you do?" Nadia asked finally. "I think," Alara said slowly, the decision forming even as she spoke it aloud for the first time, "I need to finish what I started. Not for the crown, and not because he asked me to, but because I want to know who I am when I'm not hiding, when I'm not performing failure to protect a secret. I've spent so long being careful that I've almost forgotten what it feels like to simply try." Nadia squeezed her hand, understanding written clearly across her face. "Then I'll stay too," she said. "At least until the trials conclude. I want to see how this ends, whatever it turns out to be." The 5th trial was announced 2 days later, and this time, word spread through Blackthorn territory, with a different kind of urgency. Unlike the previous 4 trials, which had been evenly spaced across weeks, the council announced that the remaining trials would accelerate, culminating in the final ceremony on the 10th night, just as tradition demanded. 6 candidates remained from the original field of dozens, each one now aware that whatever happened over the coming days would determine the future of Blackthorn Pack for generations to come. Elara approached the 5th trial with a clarity she had not felt since arriving at Blackthorn. For the first time, she was not calculating how to fail convincingly, was not measuring every word and movement against the careful performance she had constructed to protect her sister. Instead, she found herself genuinely curious about what she might discover if she simply allowed herself to try. The trial itself tested each candidate's understanding of pack law and governance, a written and verbal examination conducted before the full council, covering everything from territorial disputes to inheritance customs to the delicate balance of power between a king and his Luna. Elara had spent years listening to her mother discuss such matters before her death, absorbing knowledge she had never expected to need, and found the trial's questions surprisingly familiar despite her lack of formal education in Blackthorn's specific traditions. When her turn came to stand before the council, she answered each question with a confidence that surprised even herself, drawing on both her natural intelligence and the quiet observations she had made throughout her weeks at Blackthorn, watching how the pack truly functioned beneath its formal structures. "You demonstrate a remarkable grasp of governance for someone with no formal training in Blackthorn's customs," Elder Renshaw observed, studying her with newfound interest as she concluded her examination. "Where did you learn such things?" "My mother served as an advisor within our own pack before her death," Elara said honestly. "She believed every wolf should understand the systems that govern their lives, regardless of their standing within the hierarchy. I suppose some of that education stayed with me." Elder Renshaw made a note on his scroll, his expression carrying none of the dismissiveness he had shown toward her in earlier trials. Across the chamber, Elara caught sight of Draven, watching her with an expression of quiet pride that made her chest tighten with warmth she no longer tried to suppress. She scored among the highest of the remaining candidates in the 5th trial, a fact that sent a fresh wave of whispers through Blackthorn territory. The careful, forgettable woman who had failed her way through the first 4 trials had suddenly emerged as a genuine contender, her transformation as bewildering to the other candidates as it was fascinating to the pack members who had begun following her progress with growing interest. Priya found her afterward in the quiet courtyard behind the Great Hall, her expression carrying a mixture of amusement and vindication. "I knew you had more in you than those first trials suggested," she said, settling onto the stone bench beside Elara. "What changed?" Elara considered the question carefully before answering. "I stopped hiding," she said finally. "I spent so long trying to disappear that I forgot what it felt like to simply be honest about what I know, what I believe, what I'm capable of." "Well," Priya said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Whatever the reason, I'm glad to see it. The competition's more interesting, with you actually trying." The remaining candidates felt the shift as well, their attention now fixed firmly on Elara, in a way that made the careful invisibility she had once cultivated feel like a distant memory. Some regarded her with suspicion, wondering what game she had been playing across the earlier trials. Others, like Priya, seemed genuinely pleased to see her finally competing on equal footing. That evening, Draven found her again in the same quiet courtyard, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ancient stones as they sat together in a silence that felt comfortable rather than fraught. "You surprised the entire council today," he said, settling onto the bench a respectful distance away, though his eyes carried the same warmth she had grown to recognize and, if she was honest with herself, to crave. "I surprised myself as well," Elara admitted. "I forgot how satisfying it feels to actually try at something, rather than carefully constructing my own failure." "I hope you'll continue trying," Draven said, his voice carrying a hesitance that seemed unusual for a king who had ruled with unshakable confidence for 3 centuries. "Not because I require it of you, but because I find I genuinely want to see what you're capable of, when fear and obligation no longer stand in your way." Elara turned to study his face in the fading evening light, this ancient king who had somehow, despite every barrier she had constructed, found his way past her careful defenses. "Why me?" she asked quietly, the question she had been avoiding since the moment he first summoned her to his study. "You've ruled for 340 years, watched countless candidates compete for your attention. Why does my honesty matter more than their ambition?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer with the same careful deliberation he brought to matters of pack governance. Because ambition is common, he said finally. I have seen it in every candidate who has ever entered these trials, that hunger for power, for permanence, for a crown that promises significance beyond their own mortal years. You are the first candidate in 3 centuries who wanted none of it, who would have chosen to disappear entirely, rather than claim what so many others would kill for. That kind of selflessness is rarer than any strength or cunning I have witnessed in all my years of ruling. The words settled over Alara like something warm and unexpected, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, she found herself entirely unable to construct a careful, protective response. I don't know what happens now, she admitted honestly. Between us, I mean. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, or what you expect from me beyond finishing these remaining trials. Neither do I, Draven said, and something in his honest admission made her chest ache, with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel, for a man she had spent weeks trying to avoid. I have not felt uncertain about anything, in longer than I care to remember, Alara Voss. And yet here I am, uncertain about everything, except the fact that I want to know you better, whatever that discovery might ultimately mean for either of us. 5 trials remained, though Alara understood now, sitting beside him in the fading evening light, that the true trial ahead of her had very little to do with proving herself worthy of a crown, and everything to do with deciding whether she was brave enough to accept what her heart had already, quietly and against every careful plan, begun to choose. 3 days after the 5th trial, Draven summoned Alara to his study once more, though this time his expression carried none of the warmth she had grown accustomed to over their recent evenings together in the quiet courtyard. I have decided to withdraw you from the remaining trials, he said without preamble, his voice carrying the formal distance of a king, addressing a subject, rather than the gentleness of a man speaking to someone he had begun to care for deeply. Alara stared at him, certain she had misheard. Withdraw me? Why? The elders have grown suspicious of my attention toward you, Draven said, moving to the window, his back to her once more, in a posture that reminded her uncomfortably of their first difficult conversation in this same room. They believe I have already made my choice, that the remaining trials are nothing more than a formality I intend to manipulate in your favor. There are whispers of unfairness, of favoritism, that could destabilize trust in the process entirely. And your solution is to remove me from the competition? Alara asked, disbelief and something sharper, something closer to hurt, coloring her voice. After everything, after finally choosing to try honestly instead of hiding, you want me to walk away? I want to protect you, Draven said, turning to face her, his golden eyes carrying a weight of concern that did nothing to soften the sting of his decision. The elders are not without power within Blackthorn's traditions. If they believe the trials have been compromised, they could challenge any outcome, could make your position here, and your sister's position, far more dangerous than either of you deserve. So your answer is to make the choice for me, Alara said, standing now, her earlier hurt hardening into something closer to anger. You forgave my family's debt without asking what I truly wanted. Now you're removing me from these trials, without asking whether I'm willing to face whatever danger the elders might pose. Do you not trust me to make my own decisions, Draven? The use of his given name, rather than his formal title, seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his expression, before he masked it once more, with careful royal composure. I trust you completely, he said quietly. It is the elders I do not trust, and 3 centuries of ruling have taught me exactly how dangerous their suspicion can become, when left unaddressed. Then let me address it myself, Alara said, refusing to back down despite the formal weight of the room around them, the ancient books and centuries of tradition pressing in on all sides. I did not come this far, did not finally find the courage to stop hiding, only to be pulled from the competition the moment things become difficult. If I withdraw now, everyone will believe exactly what the elders already suspect, that I was never a genuine candidate, that whatever happened between us was some kind of manipulation, rather than something real. Draven studied her for a long moment, and she watched the careful calculation behind his eyes slowly give way to something closer to admiration. You would rather face the elders' suspicion directly than accept my protection, he said, not quite a question. I would rather prove, through my own actions, that I belong in these trials on merit rather than favor, Alara said firmly. I spent 5 trials hiding who I truly was, I will not spend the remaining trials hiding behind your protection instead. If the elders wish to challenge me, let them challenge me honestly, in the same arena where every other candidate has been tested. Something shifted in Draven's expression, the careful royal distance giving way entirely to something warmer, something that looked remarkably like pride. 340 years, he said quietly, almost to himself, and I have never once encountered a wolf who refused my protection in favor of proving her own strength. Perhaps that's precisely why you should trust my judgment now, Alara said, allowing herself a small, hopeful smile. Draven crossed the room to stand before her, closer than protocol strictly allowed, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the careful distance they had maintained throughout most of their conversations. Very well, he said finally. You will remain in the trials, and I will trust you to face whatever challenges the elders choose to place before you. But know this, Alara Voss, whatever the elders attempt, whatever obstacles they construct to test your resolve, I will not stand silently by if your safety, or your sister's safety, becomes genuinely threatened. I wouldn't expect you to, Alara said, and found herself surprised by how much comfort those words brought her. This quiet promise of protection, offered not as control, but as partnership. The sixth trial arrived 2 days later, and Alara understood immediately, from the moment she entered the Great Hall, that the elders had indeed decided to test her resolve directly. Elder Renshaw announced the trial's structure with a formality that carried an undercurrent of challenge, specifically aimed in her direction. A public debate, held before the full assembly of Blackthorn Pack, on matters of succession and inheritance, that would require each remaining candidate to demonstrate not just knowledge, but conviction, under direct scrutiny. Alara took her place at the center of the Great Hall, aware of hundreds of eyes watching her, aware of the elders seated in a formal row along the raised platform, their expressions carrying a coldness that confirmed exactly what Draven had warned her about. This was not simply a trial of knowledge. This was an examination designed to expose weakness, to find some crack in her composure that would justify the suspicion the elders had already formed. Elder Renshaw began the questioning himself, his voice carrying across the silent hall. Candidate Voss, explain to this assembly why a woman with no distinguished bloodline, no notable family standing within our territory, believes she deserves consideration as Luna of Blackthorn Pack. The question landed like a physical blow, precisely calculated to expose the very insecurity Alara had carried since arriving at Blackthorn. She felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon her, felt the particular intensity of Draven's gaze from his throne, watching to see whether she would falter beneath the elders' deliberate cruelty. She thought of her sister, of the debt they had carried together, of every careful failure she had once performed to protect what mattered most. She thought of 5 trials in which she had slowly, deliberately, chosen honesty over hiding, and she found, standing in the center of that vast, silent hall, that she was no longer afraid to answer honestly. I do not believe bloodline determines worth, Elder Renshaw, Alara said, her voice steady and clear despite the pounding of her heart. I believe worth is determined by character, by the choices a person makes when no one is watching to reward them for it. I did not come to these trials believing I deserved a crown. I came here to protect my family, and I stayed, because I discovered, through 5 trials of honest effort, that I have something meaningful to offer this pack regardless of what bloodline I was born into. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, some approving, others clearly uncertain how to receive such a direct challenge to Blackthorn's ancient traditions. Elder Renshaw's expression tightened, clearly displeased by an answer that refused to concede the weakness he had hoped to expose. Bold words for a candidate whose own family required debt forgiveness from the king himself, another elder interjected, her voice sharp with barely concealed contempt. Perhaps your worth is more convenient than genuine, given how directly it aligns with the king's own generosity. Alara felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe through it, to respond with the same steady conviction rather than the defensive fury the elder clearly hoped to provoke. The debt forgiveness was offered without my request, and without any promise of favor in return, she said firmly. I remained in these trials not because I was obligated to, but because I chose to. If my worth appears convenient to you, Elder, perhaps that says more about your assumptions than about my genuine character. The hall fell into a tense silence, and for a long moment, Elara was uncertain whether her boldness had helped or harmed her standing before the assembled council. Then, from his throne, King Draven Ashborn rose to his feet, his golden eyes sweeping across the elders with an authority that immediately silenced any further challenge. I believe candidate Voss has answered the question posed to her, with more honesty and conviction than this assembly has any right to demand, he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast hall. This trial was designed to test resolve under scrutiny, and she has demonstrated exactly that. I see no further need for this line of questioning. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unwilling to challenge the king directly despite their obvious dissatisfaction with how the trial had unfolded. Elder Renshaw made a note on his scroll, his expression carefully neutral once more, though the tension in his shoulders suggested the matter was far from settled in his own mind. As the trial concluded and the assembly began to disperse, Priya found Elara near the edge of the hall, her expression carrying open admiration. "You stood your ground against the elders themselves," she said, wonder coloring her voice. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone speak to Elder Renshaw that directly and survive the encounter unscathed." "I'm not sure I survived unscathed," Elara admitted, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "I think I've made an enemy of at least 2 elders today." "Perhaps," Priya said, "but you've also earned the respect of nearly everyone else in this hall, myself included. Whatever happens in the remaining trials, you should know that today, you proved exactly what kind of Luna you would be, if you're chosen." Elara thanked her, though her mind remained fixed on Draven's intervention, on the way he had risen to defend her before the entire assembly without hesitation. 4 trials remained, and Elara understood now that the path ahead would only grow more difficult, the elders' resistance only more determined as the final ceremony drew closer. But for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, she found she was no longer afraid of that difficulty. She had spent too long hiding from challenges to retreat from this one now, not when everything she had discovered about herself, and about the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine, hung so precariously in the balance. The 7th trial passed without incident, a straightforward test of tracking and hunting skill that Elara completed with the quiet competence of someone who had spent her childhood learning to survive in the northern hills. She placed second among the remaining candidates, close enough behind Priya's first-place finish that the 2 women shared a genuine laugh afterward, their earlier wariness having long since transformed into something resembling friendship. But the ease of the 7th trial did little to settle the unease that had taken root in Elara's chest since her confrontation with the elders. She felt their scrutiny following her through every corridor of Blackthorn Keep, felt the weight of suspicion that had not softened despite Draven's public defense of her during the 6th trial. She mentioned this growing unease to Nadia one evening, the 2 sisters sharing a quiet meal in the small servants' quarters that had become their refuge over the past weeks. "The elders won't simply let this go," Elara said, pushing food around her plate without much appetite. "Draven defended me publicly, but that only seemed to harden their resolve rather than ease it. I don't know what they'll try next, but I know they'll try something." "Maybe you're being overly cautious," Nadia suggested, though her own expression carried little conviction behind the words. 3 trials remain. Perhaps they've accepted the outcome and simply need time to adjust to it. Elara wanted to believe her sister's optimism, but 3 years of careful vigilance, of watching for every possible threat to her family's safety, had taught her not to trust such easy reassurance. She was right to remain wary, though even her careful instincts had not prepared her for how directly the elders would ultimately choose to strike. The threat arrived 2 days later, delivered not through official channels but through a folded note, left beneath Nadia's cot in the servants' quarters, discovered when she returned from her kitchen duties, to find her small collection of belongings disturbed. The note, written in a careful, deliberately anonymous hand, contained a single chilling message: "Leave Blackthorn territory within 3 days, or face exposure and expulsion for working under a false identity within the king's own household." Nadia brought the note to Elara with trembling hands, her earlier calm entirely shattered by the direct threat now hanging over her safety. "They know," she whispered, sinking onto the edge of her cot. "They know I've been working here under a false name, and they're threatening to expose me unless I leave." Elara read the note twice, her mind racing through the implications. The debt had been forgiven, which meant Nadia's presence at Blackthorn was no longer technically illegal, but working under a false identity within the king's household still violated pack law in ways that could result in serious consequences if reported to the wrong authorities. The elders had found the one remaining vulnerability in their situation, and were now wielding it as a weapon, not against Alara directly, but against the sister she had sworn to protect above everything else. "This isn't about you leaving Blackthorn," Alara said slowly, understanding dawning with a cold clarity that settled like ice in her chest. "This is about forcing me to withdraw from the trials. They know I would never let you face exposure alone. They're using you to reach me, because they couldn't break my resolve directly." "Then maybe I should leave," Nadia said quietly, though the fear in her voice suggested she understood exactly how much such a departure would cost her sister. "If my presence here is putting everything at risk, including your chance at something real with the king, maybe the safest choice is for me to simply go." "No," Alara said firmly, taking her sister's hands in her own. "I did not come this far, did not finally learn to stop hiding, only to let you sacrifice yourself to protect a competition. I'm not even certain I still want to win for the crown alone. We face this together, the way we've faced everything else." She brought the note to Draven that same evening, finding him in his study poring over correspondence from neighboring territories, his expression shifting immediately to concern the moment he saw the tension written across her face. "The elders have threatened my sister," Alara said without preamble, placing the note on his desk before him. "They want me to withdraw from the remaining trials, or they'll expose her for working under a false identity, regardless of the fact that our debt has already been forgiven." Draven read the note carefully, his expression darkening with an anger Alara had not yet witnessed from him, a cold fury that seemed to radiate outward from his very presence, in a way that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavier. "This is a violation of every principle these trials are meant to represent," he said, his voice carrying a barely controlled rage. "The elders exist to preserve the integrity of Blackthorn's traditions, not to manipulate them through threats against innocent people." "What do we do?" Alara asked, uncertainty warring with the fragile hope that had grown between them over the past weeks. "You do nothing," Draven said, his golden eyes meeting hers with an intensity that carried both protection and something deeper. "I have known about this scheme far longer than you realize, Alara. I have had my own people watching for exactly this kind of manipulation since the moment I forgave your family's debt, anticipating that certain members of the council would not accept such generosity without resistance." "You knew they might threaten Nadia?" Alara asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "I suspected it," Draven admitted. "I have watched Elder Renshaw and his allies grow increasingly desperate as these trials have progressed, as your standing among the pack has grown stronger, despite every obstacle they have attempted to place before you. I did not know precisely how they would strike, but I made certain your sister remained under quiet protection regardless." "Protection I knew nothing about," Alara said, a flash of frustration mixing with her relief. "You could have told me. You could have warned us both, instead of letting us live in fear of exactly the threat you already anticipated." "You are right," Draven said, and the genuine remorse in his voice softened her frustration considerably. "I should have trusted you with that knowledge, the same way I have asked you to trust me. I apologize for that failure, Alara. It will not happen again." He rose from his desk and moved to a small bell near the door, summoning a guard with quiet, efficient instructions. Within the hour, Elder Renshaw and two of his most vocal allies among the council stood before Draven in his private study, their expressions carrying a mixture of defiance and barely concealed nervousness as the king addressed them, with a coldness that Alara had never witnessed from him before. "I have evidence that members of this council have threatened a citizen under my protection, in an attempt to manipulate the outcome of the Luna trials," Draven said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "This is not merely a breach of tradition. This is a direct challenge to my rule, and I will not tolerate it." Elder Renshaw's composure cracked slightly beneath the king's fury. "Your Majesty, we acted only out of concern for the integrity of the trials themselves. If a candidate's family carries hidden debts, hidden identities, it raises legitimate questions about—" "The debt was forgiven by my own decision," Draven interrupted, his voice sharp enough to silence the elder immediately. "Nadia Voss's identity was concealed for her own protection, during a difficult period that has since been resolved entirely. Neither fact justifies threatening an innocent woman to manipulate her sister's participation in these trials. You have overstepped your authority, and you will answer for it." The confrontation that followed lasted nearly an hour, Draven's controlled fury never wavering as he laid out the consequences the elders would face for their actions, consequences that included formal censure and the loss of certain privileges within the council's traditional authority. Ilara watched from a quiet corner of the study, witnessing a side of Draven she had not yet seen, a king wielding his power, not for personal gain, but in direct defense of people he had come to care for deeply. When the elders finally departed, chastened and clearly unsettled by the severity of the king's response, Draven turned to Ilara with an exhaustion that softened his earlier fury into something gentler. "Your sister is safe," he said quietly. "The threat has been neutralized, and I will ensure no further attempts are made to manipulate these trials through such cruelty." "Thank you," Ilara said, the words feeling entirely insufficient for the depth of gratitude she felt, "for protecting her, and for trusting me enough to include me in resolving this, even after I learned you had known more than you initially shared. I am still learning what it means to trust someone as completely as I have come to trust you," Draven admitted, closing the distance between them, until they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that the careful formality that had governed most of their interactions finally seemed to fall away entirely. 3 centuries of solitude taught me to guard everything, including my own uncertainty. You are teaching me, slowly, that some things are worth the risk of sharing. 3 trials remained, and as Ilara stood in the quiet study with the king who had defended her sister without hesitation, she understood with sudden and overwhelming clarity that whatever happened in the trials ahead, something far more significant than a crown, had already been decided between them. The 8th and 9th trials passed in a blur of quiet determination, Ilara approaching each challenge with the same honest effort she had discovered within herself since choosing to stop hiding. The 8th trial tested endurance through a grueling day-long run across Blackthorn's mountainous borders, and though Ilara did not finish first, she completed the course with a steady resilience that earned quiet respect from candidates and judges alike. The 9th trial, a test of healing knowledge and care for injured pack members, drew on skills she had learned tending to her own mother during her final illness, knowledge she had never expected to need again, but which now served her well before the assembled council. By the time the 10th night arrived, only 3 candidates remained from the original field of competitors: Ilara, Priya, and a formidable wolf named Katrin Solberg, whose family had produced Blackthorn commanders for 6 generations. The final trial, tradition dictated, was unlike any that had come before it. There would be no test of strength, no examination of knowledge, no negotiation or debate. The final trial belonged entirely to instinct, to the ancient bond between a king's wolf and the mate it recognized as its own. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, torches lining every wall, the assembled pack gathered in numbers greater than Ilara had ever witnessed within Blackthorn territory. She stood alongside Priya and Katrin at the center of the hall, all 3 women dressed in simple ceremonial white, stripped of any adornment that might influence the ritual meant to unfold before them. Elder Renshaw, his earlier defiance chastened but not entirely extinguished, addressed the assembly with the careful formality tradition demanded. "Tonight, King Ashbourne's wolf will choose its Luna before this entire assembly. The ritual has remained unchanged for centuries. Each candidate will stand before the king, and his wolf, released from 340 years of dormancy, will indicate its choice, through recognition that cannot be feigned or manipulated." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Draven rise from his throne, his expression carrying a tension she had not seen from him, even during his confrontation with the elders. This was different, she realized. This was not a matter of politics or protection. This was the culmination of everything that had brought her to Blackthorn, the moment when his wolf, silent for over 3 centuries, would either recognize something true between them or reveal that everything she had come to feel had been nothing more than her own hopeful imagination. Katrin approached first, standing before Draven with the confident poise of someone raised to expect exactly this moment. Draven's eyes studied her carefully, and Ilara watched his expression for any sign of recognition, any flicker that might suggest his wolf had finally found what it had waited centuries to discover. But his expression remained carefully neutral, and after a long moment, he shook his head slightly, and Katrin stepped back to polite, sympathetic murmurs from the crowd. Priya approached next, and Ilara felt a complicated tangle of emotions watching her friend stand before the king, some part of her genuinely hoping Priya might find the recognition denied to Katrin, Another part unable to fully suppress her own quiet hope that the choice would fall elsewhere. But Draven's expression remained unmoved once more, and Priya, too, stepped back with the same graceful acceptance Katrin had shown. Then it was Alara's turn. She walked forward on legs that felt unsteady beneath her, the weight of hundreds of eyes settling over her like a physical presence as she came to stand before the king who had, across 10 trials, become far more to her than the distant ruler she had once feared. Draven's golden eyes met hers, and for a long moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath around them. Then something shifted, something ancient and undeniable rippling through the air between them. Draven's eyes flared with a light Alara had never witnessed before, gold bleeding into something deeper, something that seemed to carry the weight of 340 years of waiting finally finding its answer. He took a step forward, closing the ceremonial distance tradition demanded he maintain, and the assembled crowd gasped collectively as he reached for her hand, without waiting for Elder Renshaw's formal completion of the ritual. "It is you," Draven said, his voice carrying a wonder that made her chest ache with an emotion too large to name. "It has always been you, from the moment you chose to fail that first trial, rather than harm someone else. My wolf recognized something true in you long before I allowed myself to understand what that recognition meant." Elder Renshaw stepped forward, clearly uncertain how to proceed, given the king's departure from centuries of careful tradition. "Your Majesty, the ritual requires—" "The ritual has been completed," Draven said, not looking away from Alara's face, his voice carrying an authority that silenced any further protest. "My wolf has chosen. After 340 years of silence, there is no ritual more sacred than that." The hall erupted into a mixture of astonished murmurs, and, gradually, genuine celebration, the assembled pack members, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a king finally freed from centuries of solitude by a woman who had entered these trials, seeking nothing more than her family's safety, and had found, instead, a love she had never dared to imagine possible. Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked up at Draven, at the golden eyes that had watched her with such careful curiosity since the very first trial, now looking at her with an openness that stripped away every last careful defense either of them had maintained. "I came here to fail on purpose," she said softly, the words meant only for him, despite the crowd surrounding them. "I never expected to find something worth staying for. And I have spent 3 centuries believing my wolf would never speak again," Draven replied, his hand tightening gently around hers. "You proved us both wrong, Ilara Voss. Every failure you performed with such careful precision was, in its own way, the truest thing anyone has ever shown me." Somewhere in the crowd, Ilara caught sight of Nadia, tears streaming freely down her sister's face, as she watched everything they had once feared transform into something neither of them had ever dared to hope for. And beside her, Priya offered a warm, genuine smile, any lingering disappointment from her own dismissal from the ritual, entirely overshadowed by happiness for the friend she had come to respect across 10 difficult trials. The final trial had ended, not with a contest won through strength or cunning, but with a truth, finally recognized, after 340 years of patient, dormant waiting. And as Draven raised their joined hands before the assembled pack, declaring Ilara Voss his chosen Luna before the entire territory of Blackthorn, Ilara understood that everything she had once believed about hiding, about disappearing, about protecting herself through careful invisibility, had led her, against every calculation she had made, exactly to where she was always meant to be. In the days following the final trial, Blackthorn territory settled into a season of celebration unlike anything the pack had witnessed in generations. Word of the king's choice spread quickly beyond their borders, carried by traders and travelers to neighboring territories. The story of a candidate who had failed her way through the trials on purpose, only to be chosen by a wolf silent for 340 years, becoming something close to legend within weeks. Ilara found the attention overwhelming at first, unaccustomed to the weight of being seen so completely after years spent perfecting the art of disappearing. But Draven remained steady beside her through every formal presentation, every ceremonial obligation that came with her new position, his presence a quiet reassurance that she was never navigating this new life alone. Elder Renshaw, chastened by the king's public rebuke and the undeniable truth of his wolf's recognition, offered Ilara a formal apology before the full council, acknowledging that his suspicion had been misplaced, and that her character had proven itself far more thoroughly than any bloodline could have guaranteed. It was not the warmest reconciliation, but Elara accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout the trials, understanding that trust, once broken, took time to rebuild in both directions. Nadia, freed entirely from the shadow of debt and false identity that had defined her life at Blackthorn for so many months, chose to remain within the territory, taking a formal position within the kitchens under her true name at last, surrounded by people who had come to respect her, not despite her circumstances, but because of the quiet strength she had shown throughout months of careful hiding. "I used to think safety meant staying invisible," Elara told her sister one evening, the two of them sharing a quiet meal, in chambers far grander than the small servants' quarters that had once been their only refuge. "I thought if no one truly saw me, no one could hurt me, or hurt the people I loved." "And now?" Nadia asked, watching her sister with the same quiet understanding that had carried them both through every difficult year since their mother's death. "Now I think real safety comes from being known completely, and choosing to stay anyway," Elara said, thinking of Draven's golden eyes finding hers across a crowded hall on that very first night, recognizing something true in her, long before either of them understood what that recognition would ultimately mean. Priya visited often in the weeks that followed, the friendship forged across 10 difficult trials, deepening into something Elara treasured deeply, a reminder that even in a competition built around failure and hidden agendas, genuine connection had managed to bloom regardless. Katrin, too, remained within Blackthorn's inner circle, eventually taking on a role within the Pack's defense forces that suited her formidable strength, far better than the quiet diplomacy the Luna position would have required. As for Draven, the centuries of solitude that had once defined his rule gave way slowly to something he had nearly forgotten how to recognize: genuine partnership. He found himself consulting Elara not merely as a formality, but as someone whose judgment he had come to trust completely, her instincts for fairness and honesty proving invaluable as they navigated the complex business of governing a territory that had grown accustomed to a king ruling alone. 340 years, he said to her one evening, as they walked together along the same border where she had once negotiated a fair peace that had first shown him the true measure of her character. "I spent so long believing my wolf's silence meant I was destined to rule without a true partner beside me. I had nearly made peace with that solitude." "And now?" Elara asked, echoing the question she had posed to her sister weeks before. "Now I understand that some things simply require patience," Draven said, taking her hand as they walked, the setting sun casting the same long shadows across the ancient stone markers that had witnessed the beginning of everything between them. "My wolf did not stay silent because it had nothing to recognize. It stayed silent because it was waiting for exactly the right person to walk into a trial hall, wearing a plain gray dress, prepared to fail on purpose rather than harm anyone else to secure her own advancement." Elara smiled, thinking of that first trial, of the careful calculation she had brought into the circle that night, never imagining it would lead her to this moment, standing beside a king who had waited 3 centuries to find her, in a place she had once believed offered nothing but danger, and had instead given her everything she had never known she wanted. "I am glad my failures finally amounted to something," she said, laughter coloring her voice for the first time in longer than she could remember feeling truly, completely happy. "Your failures," Draven said, drawing her closer, "were the most honest successes I have ever witnessed. Every choice you made to protect someone else over yourself revealed exactly the kind of Luna, and exactly the kind of woman I did not know I had spent 3 centuries waiting to find." The pack gathered that autumn for a formal ceremony to celebrate the bonding, Blackthorn territory filled with wolves from every corner of the region, who had come to witness a story that had already become something close to legend. A woman who had entered 10 trials, intending to lose every single one, chosen anyway, by a king's wolf that had waited 340 years for someone worth breaking its silence. Elara stood beside Draven as the ceremony concluded, her sister nearby with tears of joy, rather than fear, finally streaming down her face. Priya and Katrin among the gathered witnesses, who had once been her rivals, and had become, through 10 difficult trials, something closer to family. She thought of the frightened woman who had stepped into that first trial circle, calculating exactly how to disappear, and marveled at how far that careful, hidden version of herself had traveled to arrive at this moment, fully seen and fully chosen, not for what she had pretended to be, but for exactly who she truly was. "Ready?" Draven asked quietly, as the assembled pack waited for their final words before the celebration truly began. "I think," Alara said, taking his hand and feeling, for the first time in years, no impulse whatsoever to hide. "I have been ready since the moment your wolf finally decided to speak." And as the autumn sun set over Blackthorn territory, casting gold light across a pack finally whole after 340 years of patient waiting, Ilara understood that some trials were never truly about winning, or losing at all. Some trials existed simply to reveal, slowly and honestly, exactly who a person was, beneath every careful disguise they had ever worn, and to prove that being chosen for that truth was worth far more than any crown claimed through calculated victory ever could have been.